All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Excess Exceed. This is Gearface, here to learn another character. This time from D. D, thank you so much for coming back again. It's been a little bit.
Glad to.
We are learning about Tager today, the big red man himself. I'm very excited. Um, there's not a lot of characters in Exceed that I've picked up and come to the conclusion that I had no idea what I was doing faster than Tager. So it seems like you might have some feelings on this character, D.
No comment. Please continue.
All right, it's just a normal thing that happens sometimes in Tabletop Simulator. Yeah, I'm really excited. I have no idea how this character works, but I really want to. And my understanding is that that's a pretty common sentiment, and that D's the person to talk to about this. So very excited to have you back on the call. Quick
Extremely excited
disclaimer.
to talk about Tager.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no,
go ahead. Go ahead.
no, absolutely. Quick disclaimer before we get started. As always, we're going to be talking about playing to win on this show. That's not the only way you can play Exceed. Exceed is fun and should be played for fun. Um, if any of the lines that we're describing are not the way that you want to play this character, please play the way that you do want to play. You'll have more fun that way, and you'll probably end up playing longer and get better in the long term anyway. Number two, we tend to talk about strategy on this show in kind of prescriptive terms. You'll hear us say things like, always do this, never do that. Your resources should always be spent this way, never this way. Exceed's not a solved game. I'm not an expert. D is an expert, but even his expertise is just a very informed opinion. Please develop your own lines for this character, and if you think that we've underrepresented something or misrepresented something about Tigger, please let us know because, as I said, not a solved game, and everybody can stand to learn a little bit more, especially about a character like Tigger. But yeah, with all that said, D, I am dying to learn about this dude. Tell me about Tigger.
I'd be delighted to. So Tager is one of my favorite characters. He is not strictly number one in my heart. That place has yet to be supplanted since season 2 back in the day.
Since Emogene?
Since Imogene, correct.
Yep. Okay.
She remains number one in my heart. But Tager is up there. One of my two favorite characters in season 5. Probably my favorite character in season 5, if I'm honest. I just tend to run Ragna more frequently because it's a little bit easier for people to understand from across the table. And since people tend to want to learn Ragna, I find it useful to play Ragna against them.
Right.
But anyway, I love this man. So he is a grappler. That is true in Exceed as it is true in fighting games. What that means generally is that he relies on a certain type of positioning, and he struggles to get there. And
Right.
He spends life, spends resources, spends time, pays all kinds of costs to get to his favorite position. And then when he's there, he kills you.
Right.
Now, part of grappler life is also that he is mix-up oriented. This means that once you have achieved your favorite position, not all grapplers, this is not strictly true of all grapplers, but a tendency is that once you achieve your favorite position, you haven't necessarily won the game. What you're doing is you're enforcing a mix-up. The mix-up works like this. If I win the mix-up, you take, 5 to 8 damage, 5 to 10 damage, depending on the grappler. And if you win the mix-up, I take like 2 or 3.
Right. So it's very heavily in the grappler's favor when he's initiating on his terms.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the general pattern of grappler is you struggle through neutral, the state where both players are seeking an advantage, at a profound baseline disadvantage. Grappler neutral tends to suck. Grappler neutral is hell.
Yep.
You struggle through it, you get to your favorite position, and then you throw something big. And if you win 1/3 of those mix-ups, you probably win the game.
Right.
Because you're outvaluing them so drastically by doing that.
Right. And to counterbalance that, you only have time probably over the course of the game to throw a couple mix-ups because you're not going to be in for very long.
Exactly. You're expecting to lose most of the strikes that happen when you're outside of your favorite range.
Okay.
And you're just going to eat those losses. Now, mini grapplers, Tager is actually, I think, probably the prime example of this, have ways to mitigate those losses. Tager, I think this is still true, with the possible exception of Polar Knight, has the most potential armor at baseline. I'm not going to bother running the numbers on this, but he is 2 printed on this attack.
Yep.
4 printed on this boost. 3 printed on this boost. 2 printed on this boost and this attack. So, whichever.
Yep.
one printed on this attack, and an unprinted number on this, which is an astral, so it's kind of a special case. We'll talk more about that later.
Right.
So this is a lot of armor.
Yeah.
This means that if you're sitting there at a range where you aren't going to win, you can take less damage.
So you're losing strikes, but you have more strikes to lose.
Exactly. Okay. You can afford to lose them because you're not losing them very, very dramatically.
Okay.
Now let me talk a little bit about the thing that makes Tager neutral unique, which is that it's worse than any other grappler's neutral. Even among grapplers, his neutral is the worst.
Okay.
That's because of half of this ability. Right? Yep. So when he would move 3 or more spaces, he instead moves only 2. That means that these 2 cards are different for him than they are for everyone else.
Right.
And also this boost, but I'll talk about that in a second. Dive does not hit at range 4 because he only advances 2.
Right.
So let me just, from an opening position, he plays dive, he advances 2. And if you're standing in the starting position, he doesn't hit you.
Right.
Conversely, it means that at range 2, where normally dive will jump over and miss, his dive actually does hit you.
Right, and it works the way that it does as a mix-up, or as a cross-up rather. It's range 3 dive, but at range 2.
Exactly. So it changes the range at which this has useful properties, and it notably changes the range 4 property of dive being a card, because dive is not a card at range 4 anymore.
Right.
That's extremely important. Likewise, cross at range 1 no longer beats sweep.
Yep. You just get to range 3.
Exactly. Like the opponent plays a sweep and you retreat 3 spaces. 1, 2. Done.
Yep.
And then you get a hit. All right, so, and then these boosts. This one is not going to matter as much. But yes, theoretically, you might want to retreat 3 or 4 spaces with this. And in that case, it would matter that you could only retreat 2.
Right.
What usually matters a lot more is that you want to advance a lot, and you can only move 2 with this.
Right.
So again, talking about opening positions, I'm going to get literally a random character. Just throw me somebody. There we go. To be a dummy.
Sure.
All right. But yes, you're like, all right, turn 1. I want to be at range 1, so I'm going to play this and go to range...
What? 1. Oops.
Yeah. So affectionately, when I play this boost, I typically don't say run, I say lumber, right? Like, he doesn't run.
Amble.
Yeah, he moseys,
right.
in a pronounced and imposing fashion, but he does not run.
He's incapable of running.
Yep, he literally can't.
Okay.
Well, for now. And this is also true of universal action. So if he wants to walk over here, he can pay 3 force. If he does, he will move here.
He will move 2. Okay.
Yep. He just stops. He can't move 3. This means that against somebody who has long range attacks, you end up at range 6 to 8s, and if they are capable of hitting you at that range, you're losing for a while.
Yeah.
Now, at least that's kind of the default proposition. So this is why Tager neutral is hard. It also means that Tager openings are different from everybody else's openings because you don't have dive.
Right.
It doesn't work. So your opponent can play a dive, and they will probably think that it beats everything you can play. This is not actually true, but it feels that way. Right. Because the only specials you have that hit at range 4 are these. You'll note that this is speed 3 with 3 guard.
Yep.
So it loses the dive.
Lose the dive.
This is speed 1 with no defenses, and also minimum range. It loses the dive a bunch of ways.
Yes.
So if your opponent assumes that you're playing a thing that will hit them if they are stationary, then they can play a dive and they'll win.
Right.
Yeah, I've made a lot of suggestions that correctly imply they shouldn't assume that, and you shouldn't be generally playing that. These are not usually your openers. It is sometimes okay to open with Atomic Collider, but it's usually a bad idea.
Okay.
It is sometimes hilarious to open Spark Bolt, but it is actually pretty risky because of the force cost, not so much because of the value of the attack. I think it's reasonably reliable to play this attack as an opener for silly reasons, but the fact that you're paying a force on it is an issue.
Okay. Because one of the things when we're talking about neutral in a fighting game context, that's things like movement and spacing. When we're talking about neutral in an exceed context, there's a resource cost as well. So
yes, it is spacing and also resources.
Yeah, when you say that his neutral is bad, is that also kind of partially about his economic game being bad as well?
That is true. It is a little bit less true, although well, a little bit less true than the thing that I just said
Okay.
about his movement being bad, right? That's a big issue.
Okay.
It is still true that his resources are hard. Now he's a season 5 character. This is kind of a season 5 character thing, that resources are hard,
Right.
and your life is hard for most of them. Tager, I think, is the character that I've described before as so season 5 is the season that says, here are 3 amazing things you can do. You can afford to do one of them.
Right.
Right. And Tager says, here are 5 amazing things you can do. You can do one of them.
Right.
Right. It's not so much that he gets a different amounts of things. It's that his costs are a little bit higher than most people.
Got it.
But his things are still awesome. It's just, well, for the same reason that characters who tend to have fast light hitting attacks build gauge more rapidly because they're landing their attacks. They just have to land more attacks to win. Characters who land fewer hits for a ton of damage each will tend to build gauge less rapidly.
Right.
And so characters like Tager, who want to hit with haymakers, aren't going to have a lot of gauge to spare.
Right. So it's not that he lacks for things to do with that gauge. It's that he's building it slowly enough just because of the way his kit is shaped.
Right. And he's constantly pressured to spend it.
Right.
Now let's talk about the other half of this ability, which is one of the biggest ways he's pressured to spend it. And this is kind of the first major resource decision you'll be making as Tager basically every game, is when am I using this ability?
Right.
This ability says, when you initiate a strike, you may spend a gauge to pull 2, which means that you actually have a one step more efficient and considerably more action efficient way to close distance when you say, okay, we need to, assuming that we actually have some gauge, we're at range 4. Well, now we're at range 2, and I can play dive or assault. Right. We're at range 3, and now we're at range 1.
Right.
Or in this sort of situation, drag them into the corner and then beat them up. Right.
And this isn't a before effect. It happens before you put your cards down for the strike. So it's not like a crit or something. You declare a strike, you pay the gauge, you put your card down, they respond to you, and by the time you've put your card down and they've responded to you, you've already pulled them.
Yeah, you pay the gauge, you pull them over, and then you start choosing your attack.
Gotcha. Okay.
It is notable that it's when you initiate a strike, not an action that you have to take. This means that it works with things like reading. It works really importantly in his kit with these 2 boosts.
Okay.
Which are +2 power, now a strike, and also we're at the range that I wanted to be instead of the range that you thought we were at.
Right.
Or close 2 in strike, which I think rather more infamously is the you thought you were safe. You're not.
You're not
right?
Safe.
Because we're at range 5. Okay, close 2, spend a gauge, pull 2. Now we're at range 1.
Right. Okay.
Like you're, and that is actually the thing with Tager. As long as Tager has some resources, usually 1 gauge and then like 3 or more cards in hand, you're not out of his reach.
Okay.
He has a range 8 projectile. It looks really unsafe. Well, if you don't have anything at range 8, it's perfectly safe.
It's completely safe, right?
And once he has more gauge, we can now look at the text on this attack. +1 speed for each card in your gauge. This becomes kind of insane.
Sure.
Right? He builds up 4 or 5 gauge, and this starts to become a reversal at closer ranges, where at range 3, this can be speed 6 or 7 or 8.
Right, right.
8 is usually not going to be 8, but I see it hit speed 6 pretty often.
Okay.
And at that point, at range 3, they initiate, you hit them, they're at range 1, it's your turn. You can also initiate yourself because it gains advantage. It's a really fantastic projectile. There's a reason it costs force.
Hence the force cost. Right. Okay.
But yeah, so notoriously, Tager is a grappler who's incredibly hard to get away from. He has a hard time following you. He does not have a hard time closing distance in sum total.
In sort of absolute terms, the distance between you will shrink, whether he's moving or you're moving.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. He pulls you with this. He pulls you with this. He pulls you with this. He closes with this. And then there's also 1 space of movement on each of these, even if he whiffs.
Okay. And I'm assuming that maybe even more so than with other grapplers, when you talk about you're trading life for positioning, things like that sometimes you are initiating with cards or responding with cards that don't necessarily hit just to get you closer to your opponent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
One of, in my opinion, the standard Tager openers is to strike with this card. You may notice that this is not a range 4 card.
Right, just to pretty much guarantee, like, there's nothing that's going to be hitting 7 effective guard at range 4. There's very, very few ignore armor, ignore guard options that far. So you're just guaranteeing a space of movement.
Right. If my opponent has like projectiles that push me away, then I might not want to risk this if I have the first turn. I'm probably going to move closer if that's the case.
Okay.
But against any character who isn't really solid at range 4 or greater, I can initiate with this. And what are my outcomes? They can play a block. They have a gauge. I have a space of movement. We're at range 3.
Right.
That's like a trade that's a little bit negative for you, but it's fine.
Right.
They play a focus. Cool. I close. They miss. They get a card. They lost focus. I'm happy.
Right. Yep.
They play a sweep. They miss. Then I close.
Right. Because it's speed 1.
You underspeed them.
Gotcha.
Right. They play a dive because they think that I'm playing where is it? There you go, collider.
Yep.
So they play dive, they come in, I take 3, they take 5, we're at range 1. That's really good for me.
Sure.
Right. And then any other random case of them wild swinging is going to end up with I just took a walk action and didn't draw.
Right.
And that's generally pretty acceptable outcome for me.
Right. Okay. So the fact that this is something that actually hits at range 4, but it isn't really something that you're going to want to be playing because it does lose to dive like that. But it seems like if you lose to dive, you're down 5 life, but you've also made them come to range 1 on you.
Yeah, The reason I don't like losing this into dive is just because of how good this attack is. It's not. Right. It's not because I necessarily lost that much in the strike.
Right. You're pretty happy to trade 3 spaces of movement for 5 damage to yourself. It's more about this card. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, like if I initiated and I went down, the thing that I'm really sad about is that I lost Atomic Collider in the turn.
Right.
But like if they initiate with at range 4 and I play Collider thinking it's some sort of light hitting projectile and then it was actually dive, I'm actually probably fine with that.
Right.
Because now it's my turn, we're at range 1.
And you're at range 1, I gotcha. And so the value proposition on Crimson Punisher is, what if you could do everything that you just described with Atomic Collider, but it actually beats dive?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's an important part of the opening mix-up, is that you have these 2 options and you have a way to beat cross. So opponents cannot dive safely, cannot cross safely, cannot block safely.
Gotcha.
Right. This is your opening mix-up. And if you want the 4th prong, it's block. Like your own block, which is just, I'm going to sit here and gain a gauge.
Okay.
And this is a like perfectly viable set of opening options. You should use all of these some of the time.
Okay.
You should probably be evaluating how much your opponent is likely to play cross, which is, are they a character with a bunch of ranged options when you're deciding how much to Spark Bolt, because Spark Bolt is much more committal. The fact that it has the printed force cost is a bigger
deal. The force cost, sure. Okay. And is all of this still broadly true on defense as well, or are you evaluating when your opponent's striking into you differently?
It is still broadly true on defense. On defense, so when people initiate, they're less likely to throw whiffs deliberately, right? They're not likely to play the range 4 focus, for example.
Right.
Or the range 4 sweep or whatever. But yeah, so it's a little bit less common that you're going to play a Spark Bolt, because until you get some gauge, this card is way less safe.
Right.
Like they're not likely to initiate with the cross range 4 because they don't feel like they need to. They're going to save that cross for when they feel like they need it as a safe play to get out of something else.
Right. Okay.
So you're usually not going to be responding with Spark Bolts against the range option unless, and this is an important caveat, you have boost in play. We'll talk about his boost game in a minute separately.
Sure.
But yes, you're generally happy to respond with Crimson Punisher at most ranges against most things. Be wary of Spike. That's the only thing that makes it sad.
Right.
Atomic Collider is a little bit less stable because at closer ranges you still have Spike to worry about, and also you can lose to dive and assaults. Like that's much less reliable.
Right.
But defending on turn 1, like it's a reasonable thing to do sometimes, especially if your opponent has a light hitting projectile that isn't going to push you out of range. So like there's a fairly narrow number of those. I'm thinking like Cyrus's Aria of the Winds. Many of the light hitting projectiles that deal 3 damage are ones that will also push 1, like Tiger Shot, or can get their damage buffed in some way, like this character's Explosive Shot, which is actually a 5 power projectile, not a 3 power projectile.
And is kind of like the centerpiece of his offense in the early game. So he's
it's his standard opener.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Gotcha. Fight initiates on turn 1, and you go, oh, all of these lose.
Right.
Literally all of them.
Yeah, because Explosive Shot also ignores armor, right?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah. So it actually you get a space of movement if you play the Crimson Punisher, and then you're at range 3 and it's your turn, but you let fight land the hit.
Right.
The actual correct answer against fight with Explosive Shot is well, I say correct. The thing that I would generally do as Tager in that situation is play cross.
Okay.
Because you are better at range than anybody thinks you are.
Because of Spark Bolt.
Because you have Spark Bolts in your kits. If you run out of spark bolts, then stop going to long range because you have stopped working.
Right.
But many people at range 6 or greater have a limited number of ways to do anything about spark bolts. They will have to come in a little closer to do things of their own. And if they do have long range options, then we start talking about his boost game, because this boost is godlike.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually the name of a different boost. Sorry.
Right.
This boost is very good though.
So when we're talking about fight in particular, like fight is notable in Exceed for having a particularly brutal option as part of his opening mix-up. Like I know you picked fight randomly, but most characters you're going to be able to respond with Crimson Punisher or with block more safely than you would be able to against fight. Fight's kind of a special case, right?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Like most characters, you wouldn't feel the need to cross out because you like one of these is going to work just fine.
Okay.
And so you will probably prefer to save your cross for run.
Right. But knowing that you have the option to spark bolt against a character is important to remember, because I mean I would not have ever thought of Tager as wanting to cross turn one. Like it that's counterintuitive to me, so it's worth saying that there's value there.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to make a point of it, is that and also like at closer ranges, typically grapplers especially don't strike with cross because it's positioning negative. You don't want to run away.
Sure.
But if you can land it, right, then it's totally fine to cross out because you have gauge now. And you only lost 2 spaces of movement, not 3.
Right.
And you know what 1 gauge means? It means you make up 2 spaces of movement.
Right.
Like you're fine. So winning strikes with cross is something that you're perfectly happy to do as Tager because it's definitely worth the value you get out of it, and you like are deceptively functional at range.
Okay. That all makes sense.
Yep. So the functional at range was in part the closing and ability. That's super important because it means your range is not necessarily what your opponent thinks it is, and you can decide when that is true. And then this attack, which against many projectiles requires a boost in play. It's usually going to require defend or demon cells.
Right.
But depending on your opponent, depending on what their projectile tools are, like this is very much a what is the projectile matchup like in the matchup that I'm in.
Right.
And so you'll actually have to be paying attention to your opponent for that.
You can't really make like a super generalized claim about Sparkbolt because it's so matchup dependent.
Right. Like at least the early game version of Sparkbolt. The version of Sparkbolt that has 6 or more speed is a good card that you can just play.
You just do it, especially and at closer ranges than you think, because its range band is not so bad when its speed is above the things that advance a character in.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
You can even play it as low as speed 4 because a lot of people are reluctant to respond with assault against grapplers at range 3 because, well, grapplers like to play assault at range 3. So why would you respond with assault if the grappler likes to play assault?
Okay, that makes sense.
Sensible people will still include it in the mix-up though. So it's not exactly reliable. It becomes incredibly reliable when it has 6 or more speed, but what doesn't at that point?
This also seems like a if you're making a point to say that Sparkbolt is something that you should be playing more often as Tager, until your opponent wises up to the fact that you're playing Sparkbolt more often as Tager, they're not going to be expecting a 4-speed Sparkbolt at range 3 very often. Like I could see them falling for that pretty consistently until they do wise up.
Yeah, like big things you can do that the opponent has to learn are real threats that they will otherwise disrespect are, range, early cross, Sparkbolts at low speed at range 4 or greater, where you just kind of throw a speed 1 Sparkbolt and assume that the opponent won't play dive because who would ever respond with dive?
And who would try to get closer to Tager? Right,
things like that.
Yeah.
And then let's see. Yeah, the other notable thing I should talk about is his wild swinging, because this force cost is not always drawback.
Sure. To do some invalidation strategies.
Yep. Before I forget, range 2 dive, also a keeper.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, like that's a thing that people have to learn that you can do because most people can't do it, and then they get hit by it. Okay, but yeah, so invalidation tech. If you're at range 1, you can probably wild swing. The things you have that don't hit are spike and dive. Everything else in your deck hits.
Yep.
Because this is invalid, and if these may or may not be invalid, but if they're valid, you probably want them. And if they're invalid, fine and good.
Right.
And then everything else hits, and sometimes you get some nasty option selects. So an option select is when you get to make a decision after information's been revealed in a way that looks blatantly unfair. The cost you pay is that you're not generally able to control that decision perfectly. So the ideal thing is when you go, okay, we're at range 1, I wild swing, I reveal a force special, or an ultra that I can pay for. And my opponent reveals their attack. Now we have both seen both of our attacks, but I get to choose whether I validate or not.
Right. And you're saying, well, okay, this attack that I wild swung loses to my opponent's attack. Let's mulligan.
Yep.
Let's try that again.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So like, oh well, in that case, I guess I won't do that. So like for instance, right, if your deck is these 2 cards and if you have the gauge, let me make this super clear for anyone watching this, for posterity. If a wild swing does not have a cost, you cannot choose to invalidate it. You're stuck with it.
Right.
Right. You wild swing, you top deck spike. Oh well, you're playing spike. I don't care if you're at range 1.
Right.
You're stuck with it. But if it has a cost, then you can make that choice. So you're at range 1. Your opponent plays focus, and you go, "Oh, cool! I won the strike because I invalidate this, and then this stuns it."
Yeah, you choose which one. The difference in the math for you is whether you also lost your buster or whether you top decked your ultra, so you still have this in your deck. That's the only difference.
Right. Yeah, because they play a focus, you stun it with this. They play a a sweep, I guess. Yeah, that, and you stun it with this.
Right.
But like, and depending on what other character specifics are. But yeah, that's part of the benefit of having the extra force special is that wild swing is a little bit more reliable, so that you get to have a projectile and also still be able to wild swing without just oops, I projectiled at range 1 and lose.
Right, you can just invalidate that. And this also kind of speaks to the economic question I had earlier, where he's able to maintain some hand resources because you're wild swinging at range 1.
Yeah, and yeah, so like you need to be wild swinging in order to have a hand at all.
Okay.
Because as previously mentioned, like Tager is resource pressured in a bunch of different directions. He's going to have a hard time getting in until he has gauge, and then he's going to be pressured to spend that gauge constantly.
Right.
It's like what you generally want to do is to not spin the gauge and still stay close, which means smart and careful play, patience, and then wild swinging when it seems appropriate, because that's a way to conserve resources during strikes, whether on offense or on defense.
So then your hand, then, when you are running your game plan, when you're in a situation where you want to be, your hand is either for things like EX attacks or for you've found a hole in your opponent's defenses. They're down a certain option, and that something's unbeatable. You'll play that option then. Otherwise, you're okay to wild swing.
Yeah, your hand is usually not going to be well. It depends on what happens to be in your hand, what happens to be in your deck. Because if you need to represent a certain mix-up threat and it's in your hand, then use it because you have it. It is playing the thing that you want to play is better than playing the mix-up from deck when you aren't sure what's left, and and you don't necessarily want to initiate with block at range 1 or spike or range 1 or whatever.
Right.
So it's still good to have those options, but generally speaking, in my opinion at least, your hand is a collection of resources and boosts.
Sure.
And some of those boosts are really, really good, where you can throw out things like this. It's also a good place to collect EX attacks. This is one of the most devastating EX attacks that you can have.
Okay.
Because this becomes speed 4 with 1 armor, 4 guard. The opponent can't dive, they can't cross, they can't grasp, they can't sweep. They can, trade down with focus, I guess.
Right.
It's godlike.
Yeah, but an attack that only loses to 1 normal is usually like a 3 or 4 gauge ultra. So getting that kind of consistency off of an EX attack is definitely notable.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, it costs you both copies of Powerful Blow, which is, a little sad because Powerful Blow is great, but it's a little cheaper than having to use Powerful Blow. As far as that goes. It's
yeah, you don't need to. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So like you're spending 2 cards to win a strike instead of 3 cards to win a strike.
Right. I gotcha. So when we're talking about before we get into sort of like the kit proper, when we're talking about some of those resource decisions, like the big one that you mentioned first, the using your gauge to pull to, yeah. Mm-hmm. It might be too broad a question to ask, when are you doing this? So instead I might phrase it as like, what is that competing with in terms of expenditure? And when do I prefer to use that versus saving up for an ultra or his exceed mode or various other things?
Sure. Let me answer that by referring to Tager's fantasy, his key design idea, which I typically refer to as the character's fantasy, which is patience. Tager is a character who is actually ready to take the slower paced game over most other characters, where he goes, okay, we're at whatever range. A rushdown character is going to go, all right, I need to get in their face and start swinging. I have to, right? Because otherwise I'm gonna die before I can get in and do stuff. Taker's a character where you should go, all right, let me find my armor, my armor, my armor, or my armor.
Right.
Or my armor. Sorry, I forgot this one. Anyway, and brace myself and let myself lose. Or if you don't even necessarily have to do these. You can just be like, all right, I'm going to eat a couple hits. I'm going to take a few losses here. Let me build up my resources. And then gradually walk forward. And once you get close enough, then you can start your party.
Right.
Because if you are here with 7 cards in hand, then the opponent is in a ton of trouble.
Right.
So you will take those losses. That's your... I'm paying the grappler neutral tax. I'm going to be losing some amount of the time here where I just am kind of helpless, because being pinned down and helpless is part of your existence. Then the rest of it is being able to throw completely soul-crushing, back-breaking mix-ups.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the use case for this, you're not necessarily using it when
I don't recommend using it aggressively. Like
right.
I mean, I do mean aggressively, but to be more specific, I don't recommend using it all the time.
Okay. Okay.
Like,
you don't recommend using it. You don't recommend mashing the button aggressively.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, like
okay.
You are not playing a rush down character. You don't always need to be in your favorite range, because you don't always need to be winning strikes. You can take losses a decent amount of the time. Like, get used to that idea. Like let your opponent wail on you as long as you can control your losses, and make sure that you know that you're coming back in afterwards.
Okay.
You know, I think I've what's the word? Derided the prepare action a couple times before, where it's like it's often not your best action. It's a thing that you can do where you say, I've either won neutral or lost neutral. I'm either ahead or I'm behind.
Right.
You do it when you're ahead, where you go, I'm converting my advantage into cards.
Right.
You do it when you're behind, when you go, well, I've already lost the next strike.
I
Fine.
might as well. Right.
I'll get some cards.
Yeah.
And Taker's a character where you're more willing to do that second option than a lot of characters that I play.
Got it. Okay. And that's sort of like, in fighting game terms, that's the equivalent of like when you're in the middle of being comboed, you like crack your knuckles, like you stretch your hands a little bit, you get ready for the next exchange, because your opponent's not going to drop it, and you're okay with that.
Yeah, like and it is the direct equivalent, in my experience at least, of playing Tager, where you're just going, okay, my opponent is out of my reach and they are not magnetized, and I don't have Spark Bolt online, so I'm just going to be taking damage for a little while as I walk forward. You know, walk forward and block anytime a hitbox comes near me, and keep walking forward. And eventually I'll get close enough that they either have to jump over me and I catch them, or I can throw something at them and then they die.
Right.
I think that's life.
And when you're saying walking forward, you mean taking the move action, or you just mean, initiating strikes with movement on them?
Any of the tools that I've described so far. So I do mean this boost. I do mean the walk action, where you'll walk 1 or 2 spaces. Walking 1 is actually a pretty decent way to just go, I'm not throwing away a lot of resources, I'm just taking a step closer. So you're still in the same losing position, but you're allowing yourself not to fall down on resources. So in situations like here, you've got like 2 or 3 cards in hand or whatever, you might be tempted to pay 2 force to go here. This risks them immediately running away out here, where you're now not in a better position, but you're down more cards than they are.
Right.
And that's a little bit dangerous. So it's fine to be a little more conservative with your movement, where you're going to keep them close enough that you can hit them, but make sure you don't lose all of your cards in hands, because you actually do like having a hands.
Okay, so you don't want to let them bait you into chasing them too aggressively, because they can get away better than you can follow them.
Right. Although conveniently, it's usually hard to do that anyway. Like Tager himself kind of enforces that play, because if your opponent goes over here, you cannot ditch your hand to go range 1. You don't have the option.
True. Yeah, you can get to mid.
Yeah, you can at most boost this and spin the gauge to pull 2.
Right.
And because that is an option, you need to be careful about how much you extend yourself when you're doing that kind of thing. Because if you do all this and then they play their second cross and you're out this ultra and that gauge and you're still at range and it's their turn, that's not so good.
Right.
Like that means you need to do what I was just describing, where you're going to sit back and take your lumps, rebuild your resources, be patient. You'll get your chance.
Does that patience extend to when he's actually in a 1 position as well, or is that when you suddenly turn the gas on? So if I get my opponent here, and as you mentioned, I could be wild swinging here and just applying an immense amount of pressure. Am I doing that, or am I putting down a boost here, or am I?
In my experience, generally, I'm going to be using it depends on how much value you think you're getting out of every turn. one of the best things you can do at range 1 exactly is this boost. This boost is actually like the pinnacle of your range 1 value in a turn.
Okay.
Because of how much this gauge can do for you, and the fact that you're getting an extra card out of it. I consider Gadget Finger absurdly strong, despite it really looking like a mediocre key charge.
Okay.
Like, if you get to play this twice in a row, and your opponent spent the time, preparing or changing cards or whatever, like you won those 2 turns. That's phenomenal for you.
Got it. Okay.
Because free gauge on a character where resources are this tight is a huge deal. And the gauge thresholds that you have to hit are also important. Basically everybody in the game can guarantee 2 gauge because you have 2 copies of block.
Right.
So if you're at least a little bit careful, you can do it. And most characters in the game are not going to have a hard time getting 1 or 2 more gauge because normals exist. You
Right.
have lights. You have on curve buttons that you can get at least a couple more hits with. But the magic number you want to hit with Tager is 5 gauge, which will let you do whatever you want. Because at 5 gauge, you have on curve range 2, 10 power.
Yep.
A 1 to 3, 8 power, 2 armor, 6 guard. And
your exceed mode. And for some of these, if you have 5 gauge, you could have this and one of these for the cost of 5 gauge. You could pull in and do your thing. If you were spending an ultra, you could use your character ability and also hit with the ultra with 5 gauge. So that's what you're looking for, kind of no matter what play you're running.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the, like, with proper play, you should be able to get there, but you might not be able to get much more than that. And then Gadget Finger is the extra value of, now you might actually see 7 or 8 gauge in a game if your opponent is letting you sit around and do that.
Okay.
And at that point, things get ridiculous, because if you hit that much gauge, then you can start to look for this rider and be in exceed mode hitting for 13.
Right.
For no good reason.
Right.
Like, the opponent really should not have let this happen. You can also do things like play this attack at range 3 and, still have options if they play to focus. By the way, this is to focus. Please note, don't be careful. Don't always play this at ranges greater than 1. It's perfectly fine at range 1.
Right.
I'm slightly notorious for holding this and playing it EX because 1-11-7 is a really fun stat line.
It's true. Yeah, I'm not used to there being double-digit power on an exceed card, so I'm a little bit in love with this card already.
It's really good. It works perfectly fine at its printed stat line. It also has this effect on it so that if you do get more gauge than even you needed, it becomes that much better.
Right. So 5 gauge is what I'm looking for in order to run my crazy win condition stuff, and then maybe a couple more gauge here and there, either to develop an overage to threaten something even crazier, or as sort of mitigation on my character ability to pull my opponent back in so I can keep on gaining gauge through other means.
Right, and generally you're going to have the reason 5 gauge tends to be hard, it's a thing you can do, but it's going to take a lot of work, is because you will occasionally be forced to use this to stop your opponent from getting too far out of reach.
I see.
Or building up too much of an advantage. Right, so if the opponent is like, sorry, I need a lozenge here. But yeah, if the opponent obtains some sort of dominant boost advantage, then you may well, depending on the character, be able to drag them to range 1 and play a block or a focus or whatever. And that's what a lot of people do. If the opponent has +2 speed or something, you just go to range 1 and now you play something that doesn't care about their speed very much.
Right.
But doing that still incurs a cost. And so, like, do you take that loss of, we're at range 3 and I'm going to eat a dive that I don't really have anything to do about, or do I spin the gauge, pull in, maybe still lose to dive, but at least they don't hit me.
Right.
Yeah, every spare gauge you get is one that lets you play a little more safely, play a little more reliably in those situations where it would otherwise be really, really hard to make that decision. And you don't need to get 5 gauge. You can run the more aggressive Tager line, you can use your ability a bunch, and go into melee. In that case, I think you will almost always be initiating from deck, though, and that tends to have issues with, that tends to have issues, because as good as your set of cards is, it's... how do I put this? If you sit at range 1, and every single turn, your opponent boosts some sort of stat, and then you wild swing, then you will probably lose that game.
Right.
because you're not quite good enough to stand up to like card quality +1 boost every single turn.
Right. You might be able to do it occasionally, but you're gonna run out of gas before they do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And like one of your strongest payout cards, I should say all of your strongest payout cards, if I just look at these, cost something to use. So even if you wild swing them, you have to pay a force or pay some gauge.
Right.
So it's like you can use this ability a lot if you want to, but I think you're going to end up sticking yourself with a lot of initiating wild swings. And then the opponent can do things that make it really, really hard for your wild swings to win.
Right. Okay.
I don't super love that. I tend to prefer use your ability in specific situations when you need to. When you go, okay, I'm now in a position where it's worth the gauge because they're going to be hitting me for much damage for 3, or or for example, I can pull them into the corner, right?
Right.
If you're here, 1 gauge to pull them into the corner is probably more value. It's probably worth doing regardless, because it's now a pain for them to get back out of the corner.
Right. So you're like the default option, sort of like the first time you look at Tager, you're like, okay, this is for keeping my opponent close to me. And that's true. But in order to justify its cost, you kind of need it to, you kind of need a use, like a justification for it greater than just keep them close to you. It's got to be move them into a disadvantageous position, or it's got to be diffuse something that they're doing. Like I want more than just proximity, because what I'm also trying to do is build gauge.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, like I think generally if you're saying I'm going to be mashing this button all the time so that we're always at close range and always swinging, then you're probably not going to perform well, because you're not really playing to his strengths. Like Tager is built to be patient. You don't need to be doing that. You don't need to be mashing your face in your opponent constantly. Right. You can wait, and then you can kill them. The card that exemplifies this, I'm going to just take a quick detour to talk about this card.
Right.
Is this card.
That's a lot of power.
This is an Astral that I've actually played a lot.
Okay.
Might be one of my most played Astrals. Because it is not that hard for this to hit 6 armor. Like, if I get to 6 gauge, then this card is a 6 armor 3 guard, 1-3 that hits for 16.
Right. So it's a 22 delta 22 delta card.
And they will hit you first, to be clear. I mean, it's speed 0.
It's 0 speed. That's like an 8 delta card is high, dude. That's almost 3 times what a high delta card is. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's insane.
Okay.
And the reason that I play this so often is in part because people often are going to feel pressured at close range to play their block. They're often going to feel pressured to parry your Genesis Emerald Taker Buster so that they don't eat 10.
Right.
But if they run out of blocks, they run out of parries, if they have parry, not every season has parry.
Yes.
Then you can pick this up and go, okay, well, I see you don't have any way to deal with this anymore. And now you're holding half of the mix-up where they dive or they die.
Right.
Right? Because they can dive over you. Note that's... So I talked previously where at ranges 2 and 3, this loses to focus. At range 1 to 3, this loses to dive.
Right.
Right? Like, and then this loses to dive at ranges 1 to 3 as well. So be aware of the things that these lose to. They're not unbeatable attacks.
Right. It's still a mix-up. And for the Astral, generally the problem with an Astral is that you can't afford to take your foot off the gas long enough to manually reshuffle. If the idea with Taker is being patient, Tager, not Taker. Although he is kind of a wrestler. I guess Undertaker sort of works. Although he'd be Kane, right? He's the big red machine. We can't keep talking about wrestling. Sorry. I'm gonna divert the whole lesson here. If the Undertaker, if anybody is going to manually reshuffle in order to get an Astral, it's somebody who is using a very patient game plan. Is that
right? It's somebody who can afford to take a turn off. And because generally the worst thing about reshuffling is I took a turn off and only drew a card. Astrals mitigate that slightly. They say I took a turn off and I drew a card that has at minimum burst on it.
Sure.
Which is pretty useful. And maybe the opponent spends a turn to parry it, but if so, that's fine. That's a card that wasn't in my deck to begin with that I lost. I didn't really lose any options out of my deck.
Right.
But Tager is a character where taking that turn off is something that you generally should be able to do anyway. And you'll often need to take the reshuffle action because as a grappler, you care about keeping your mix-ups live.
Right.
Both copies of this go down, or both copies of this go down, or both copies of this go down. You should probably be looking to reshuffle soon.
Okay.
Like it's important. So I have similar feelings about the ultras, where it's like, oh, three ultras total, or are in your discard pile. Probably look at reshuffling soon. The value on them is very, very high.
All right, that makes sense. And so you're getting King of Tager is not. It's not even necessarily like you're going out of your way to do it. You might have to manually reshuffle, and oh look, you have a 16 power card in your hand now.
Right. And the question then is whether you can withstand your opponent's attack long enough for it to be a viable threat.
Right.
Because you may or may not still have 4 gauge. You may have already played one of these, and therefore you're down below 4 gauge. This also usually isn't a 4 gauge card. It's usually a 5 or 6 gauge card because you need to have a little extra to make it safe.
little something on top of it. Sure.
Yeah, like at 5 gauge, again, that magic number of 5 gauge. This is 3 armor, 3 guard, which is fine. It's at 6 gauge that it shines as being something that just doesn't lose a strike. And more than that is just excessive. You generally aren't getting more than that. This also does have some. Well, anyway, this card is deceptively good. If you want to know what makes it even better, it's this boost. This boost says now this hits at ranges 1 to 4. The opponent can't cross out.
Yep.
If you manage to corner yourself, then
they can't dive over you.
It wins.
Yep.
Yeah, like it beats dive, cross, and also everything else. So I guess you're just dead.
Right.
But note the expense, right? You had to have this, and you had to play this. That's a boost that costs a force and an astral, and you managed to get to 6 gauge while the opponent was here. How did all of this happen?
Right.
Like,
yeah, you needed to be playing pretty carefully in order to get to that point.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's kind of a theme of this boost, by the way, is this boost will make anything stupid, but it's expensive, and it's more expensive than it looks. It's hard to play because of how reliable this attack is at just kind of being a thing that you can throw out with 2 armor and a close 1, so that you're not afraid of getting crossed or swept or anything.
Right.
Or even grasped, really, because you took 1, okay, and now you're back at range 2, and that's fine. Like, it's a really, really safe, reliable attack that is very, very free, very resource, not resource intensive, on a boost that is resource intensive, and usually combines with something else that's resource intensive, because you usually play this boost with in
order to pay off something big.
Yeah, one of these things, which are all expensive.
Sure.
Where you go, oh, I can play EX Gigantic Taker Driver at range 2. It's on curve. It's 1, 2, 8, 6. Right. So range 2, power 8, speed 6. But it cost me 2 copies of this, a force, this, and another force. That's a hand.
Yeah,
that cost me an entire hand.
So part of the reason that you're playing so patiently as Tager is so that you can afford to make plays like that every once in a while. You can't do that every turn, and you might not even be able to do that every game.
Yeah. That's the thing. The examples I just gave are things where you had a thing that was probably unbeatable. Right. Most of the time, you're not going to do something like that. You're going to do something that takes 2 or 3 cards out of your hands, and is mostly unbeatable, because that's the mix-up strategy that I described before, where every 3 mix-ups you win 1, and that wins you the value of 3 mix-ups.
Right. Because you're hitting so hard.
Yeah, you're hitting unbelievably hard.
Right, I gotcha. Okay. So, do we want to talk about we've sort of mentioned them as part of the game plan, but do we want to go through the kit itself as sort of discrete cards and boosts to talk about their use cases a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm going to make an additional note as we do that, which is every time I talk about a card, we're just going to take a moment and admire his Exceed mode, and you'll see why this is.
Okay.
All right, so let's start with this one. I think this is actually kind of the most underwhelming card, despite being really, really good, because this is one of those. It's a little like Baiken Tatami Gaishi. It's a card that doesn't really lose. It's speed 4. It's got 1 armor, 3 guard, so it doesn't lose to assault. Doesn't lose to grasp. Trades down against focus and sweep. Against cross, the opponent gets away, but you close 1 space. It's kind of okay at everything. It's not really remarkable at anything.
Okay.
It is nice in that it works as a range 3 alternative to assault. It doesn't give you advantage, but it means that you can initiate with a thing where the opponent can respond with sweep and you still have mitigation, their own assault, and you actually still win the strike.
Right.
Because, anyway, it's reasonable in that case. let's take a moment to acknowledge that 7 guard is a lot.
Yep.
And this just can't be stunned by anything once you do that. 5 power does not really matter here. We're not going to care about that. This boost I've already talked about. I think if you can play this boost, you should.
Okay.
You will almost never value this attack more than this boost.
Okay.
If you're at range 1.
Right.
If you're at range 1.
Of course. And so Sledgehammer is a range 3 play to get to range 1. But as you've said a couple times now, if you have a way to get to range 1 next turn or the turn after that while still preserving Gadget Finger, just do that instead.
Generally, yeah.
Okay.
Like all the properties of this attack that I value are the reasons I'm perfectly happy to see it as a wild swing.
Okay.
Like I'm not usually going to play this attack from hand, except in niche situations. But I do value it as a wild swing. I mostly value this boost.
Makes sense.
All right. Okay, let's start getting to the fun stuff. Crimson Punisher. This is your block killer. It's the reason that your opponent can't play block safely at range 1.
Yep.
Now it's your focus killer.
Yep. With 1 more power, you kill focus.
Yep. It's already pretty good against focus because you're hitting for 5 and you're taking 2.
Yep.
But this makes it just stun focus outright for some reason, which is very amusing.
Yeah, that doesn't happen super often.
Mm-hmm. It is also a card where the after close 1 means that you can basically throw this out anytime you want, and unless you exactly get spiked, right? Unless your opponent manages to stun this somehow,
right?
It's fine because you had some armor and you close the space. That's pretty good.
Yep. Yep. So like, very, very small loss condition in most cases, and a pretty devastating win condition if you catch the right card with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And you already talked about it being an important turn 1 play to get a little bit of space on your opponent and to catch dives and things like that.
Yep. Yeah, it can make up distance when you are getting pushed back by projectiles, where you're now not getting pushed back as much.
Okay.
And it has a little mitigation in the form of that armor. It's also fine to just as loath as I am to admit it, right? It's fine to prepare turn 1 when you have this because you can just respond with it and it works just as well.
Right.
I like initiating with it because it means that now the opponent's at range 3 and they will feel pressured by that because they don't want to give me a turn at range 3.
Right.
But it's perfectly fine to just play this basically whenever you want.
Okay.
I've talked about the boost already, where it's a thing that enables a lot of plays. I like to use it. Well, I don't really like to. When I use it for guarantees. I use it to go, oh, now this thing doesn't lose to whatever it lost to.
Right.
But it's really, really expensive.
So as you mentioned, you've got EX gigantic Tager driver.
Mm-hmm.
Or an
one
ultra,
copy of this.
Yeah, some combination of very, very expensive things that you're making guaranteed, maybe to close out a game.
Yeah. What I do when I enjoy playing this boost, it's usually because I'm doing something with normals. I'm playing like an actual range 4 dive, where I'm threatening a spike dive mix up at range 4.
Right.
Or I'm playing assault at range 4, which works just fine. Or I'm playing grasp at range 2, or I'm playing spike at range 2. Why would I play spike at range 2 with this range boost? Well, because they think I'm playing grasp at range 2.
Right.
So that's clear.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
But yeah, it's good at doing that. It's just kind of expensive.
Yeah, and so if you have the economy to staple it onto a normal instead, you should, or is it when you're playing it you pretty much always find yourself playing it on the really expensive stuff because that's what it's for?
So if you're ahead enough that if you have this in your hands, it means you didn't play the attack, which means you're probably doing well enough that you can afford to play this boost on something awesome.
Okay.
Is kind of my experience.
That makes sense.
I mostly prefer to play the normal plays with it, but because I don't have these other things in my hand. Like that's why I make so many normal plays with it that I described.
Okay.
Is because I just didn't have these, and I'm like, okay, well, I want to make a range 4 play. I've got a bunch of resources. I don't really need to play this as an attack to move in. I'll just play range 4, sweep, spike, assault, dive. Like they all work.
Got it.
And I actually had the resources for it, and that's fine. But yeah, most often I'm going to be playing this as an attack.
Okay.
The boost is much more situational.
Makes sense.
And yes, we already admired the 6 power stuns focus. I guess we could also note that 2 armor 9 guard isn't getting stunned, but it probably won't matter because this wasn't getting stunned anyway.
Right.
Usually. All right. Right. So this is a deceptively good attack that also is deceptively shaky because only 3 guard means that it will lose to dive and assault.
Yep.
and a bunch of other things like that, right? Other people's equivalents to Sledge, where it's like, this didn't deal much damage, but it did enough. So Atomic Glider...
This counts as enough for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, well, 4 ain't much, but it's enough.
It's enough, sure.
And that can be an issue. So with Atomic Glider, you'll often want to first bolster it with one of Defend, Heavy, or Demon Cells.
Yep.
We'll talk more about that. Well, we'll talk more about these two in particular in a bit. But, excuse me, that also risks telegraphing it a bit. I tend to like playing Atomic Glider like against projectiles that are low damage, where I'm getting 2 spaces of movement, and if I'm wrong, it's probably because they came in and stunned me. Or my favorite is to EX this,
right?
Where I just go, okay, here's my unstunnable attack that hits everything and has 7 power.
Right.
Cool. Like you're dead.
Hope you have a focus.
Yep. And then if I'm playing it at range 1 anyway, then okay, I'm trading 5 to 3 against focus. I'm pretty okay with that.
Right.
Or maybe I'm not trading against focus.
Right.
Because I have an 8 power EX attack instead.
Yep.
Now that's kind of overkill. If you are in Exceed mode, then you just play 1 copy of this, because now it's a 7 power, 7 guard, doesn't get stunned by anything, hits everything. Cool. It's just free.
Yeah.
Right. Not strictly. Dive can still run over it, like jump over it. But Exceed mode Atomic Glider is one of those just godlike attacks that you can throw out whenever you want, and it went from a little shaky to amazing.
Right.
The hit effects is also let me point out how the effects in this work, just because they're a little bit weird. I don't know if people have been wondering why this range 1 and 2 card hits at range 4. It's because the before is pull 2. So if you start at range 4, you'll go here. Then on hits, because you hit at range 2, you'll pull 1 or 2. So typically at range 4, you'll go to range 1 with him in the corner.
Yeah.
That's what you like to do. If you played it in a different position, like this one, then it's not going to matter as much, because they're going to be on either side. Doesn't matter.
You pick a side.
Yeah. You typically will not use it to pull them out of range 1, because why would you do that?
Right.
But in situations where you can pull them out, where you must pull them out of the corner with it, so at range 3, I generally recommend against using this. Like, I don't want to play range 3 Atomic Glider where I must pull the opponent out of the corner with it.
Right.
Because I'm now giving them the rest of the board.
You're giving them space to cross out or something like that.
Yeah, and I'd rather not do that. I'd much rather do it in a situation where I'm at 4 or I'm at close range, where I'm going to drag them back in from crossing out.
Right. Okay.
Like that is the reason that this is shaped exactly the way it is so that it beats cross at range 1.
Right.
Like that's the point of this card.
Right. Yeah, it's a cross catcher. The 3 guard. When we were saying it's not enough for a lot of things, it is enough at least for cross.
Yeah, it's enough for cross. It's enough for grasp.
Gotcha.
And the opponent will like to play cross and grasp against you at range 1, because of our next card.
Okay.
Well, let me talk about this boost briefly.
Sure.
Good boost. It's expensive. I'm not sure if I need to say anything else.
Yeah. Plus 2 power now strike is pretty dangerous.
Yep.
You put it on something. You hit a break point. You've got some action compression. Action compression does not seem like the kind of thing that Tager needs very often or wants very often, because he is trying to play patiently. But I imagine when you're in a good position, it's kind of like with reach. Like if you're trying to cash out on something, now's the time to do it.
It's like the ability, it's like reach, and it's like this boost, where it's if it's the thing you need, then it is overwhelmingly effective at being that.
Right.
Because the opponent thought they were safe and they're not.
Right.
So this boost in particular pairs well with sweep, because 8 power sweep just destroys the world.
Yep.
It's pretty hard to deal with. That's like the standard breakpoint that matters the most with it, is now your sweep does 8 damage.
Right.
I can't think of anything else that is extremely notable with it.
You put it on an EX attack or something like that, and you're probably in business. But plus 2 power now strike on its own is pretty scary.
Yep. So it's nice to threaten sweep with it. If you throw it onto EX assault, that's great, of course. But yeah.
Yep.
All right. So yes, I was saying people like to play fast attacks at range 1 because of our next card.
Yep.
This is the command grab. It's Gigantic Tager Driver. It is his iconic. This is my command grab. This is the reason that you don't want me to be at range 1 for very long, or at least the primary reason. There's a bunch of reasons, but
right.
Which is power power 5, so it's undercurved by 2 points, notably. So it's lower than cross at range 1.
Yep.
That does 7 damage, so it's stun sweep, but not focus.
Not focus,
and
right?
forces a discard. That's pretty strong. It is a force special. You get what you pay for. It's worth the cost. It gets really stupid if you exit, because then it gets even more expensive. I will take a moment to admire this, though. 8 power, stuns focus. And 4 guard means that this actually becomes a pretty janky defensive tool against faster buttons like assaults.
Right.
Where the opponent cannot reliably do those things. Now, granted, when you're in exceed mode, it's not like you're going to beat assault with it. It's that they're not going to play assault, but that's still useful.
Okay, yeah, it turns off one half of their mix-up or something.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
It also means that there's a lot of board situations where you can play Reach with Gigantic Tiger Driver, even at close range, and it just stops losing to anything.
Right.
Because in various board states, this will be Grasp.
Right. If you have enough guard on it, the guard isn't going to stop you from losing to Grasp or Cross most of the time, except, well, with Reach, maybe it will.
Yeah. And so that's Reach doing the job that we already talked about.
Yep.
But yeah, Gigantic Tiger Driver's value is generally that you just played at range 1 in a situation where you could be playing it, or Grasp, or Assault, or Crimson Punisher, or Sweep, and then they have to guess.
Yep.
And if they get it wrong, they explode.
Yep.
I
mean,
yeah.
so this is Tager's game plan in a card, basically. When you were describing that he's going to get in and win 1/3 of his mix-ups. Yeah, 1/3 of his mix-ups on this 7 unanswered damage is about 2 strikes worth of damage. That's pretty devastating.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. That is a good way to summarize it. Is like this is my. If I lose, I'm out a bunch of resources, but I'm out like 3 life.
Right.
Okay. I'll wait. I'll come back. If I win, we're out about the same number of resources, and you're down 7 life.
Right. And exchanges and exceed off of 1 card generally come in like 2 like if I win with Sweep, for example, I won against a Grasp and I'm up 3. Being up 7 doesn't happen super often.
Correct.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Like this is gonna the thing that this like range 1 focus is a thing that people will very often like to play against, especially frontside Tager, where you go, okay, I trade badly against this, but at least I'm not afraid of this.
Right.
Right. Like people like to play range 1 focus because, okay, at least I'm not afraid of this. One of the reasons I buy the Exceed mode and all the interactions that it changes in that way. And also one of the things that Powerful Blow is useful for is dissuading people from doing that.
Right. It helps deal with that weakness of his.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But even if they do, it's a thing where like focus is a card that's nearly impossible to trade up into. And so landing an attack as strong as this into it is technically a trade down, but it's into focus. Like that's fine. That is more than you expected value against focus.
They've only got 2 of them. You're it very rarely loses to much of anything. You're happy with what you got against that card.
Yep, and that's for your foci for everything else.
Yep.
Where it's exactly.
Okay.
This boost. This is a 0 force 3 armor boost. That's really good.
Yes.
So this showcases much like this card does actually. One side of the card is way more expensive than the other, where Crimson Punisher is an attack I refer to as pretty free to play with the expensive boost.
Yep.
Gigantic Tager Driver is an attack that's expensive to play with a totally free boost.
Okay.
If you have 1 card in hand and it's this card, you're probably not playing it as an attack because then you would have to spend gauge to validate it if you have gauge.
Right.
But you can play this boost anytime you want. Like at any point in the game at which you think your opponent is likely to hit you in the next strike, this boost is perfectly acceptable to play.
Okay.
It's just not a mistake. The only thing I would be worried about is if you're boosting your second copy of this card.
I was going to ask, just to maintain the threat of the mix-ups, you need Tager Driver to scare them.
Yeah, you don't want to get out both Gigantic Tager Drivers because at that point they stop being as afraid of you at range 1.
Right.
Like the only way you force them to keep respecting you is when you have enough gauge to threaten ultras, or if you pop them with an EX and they don't forget that.
Right.
They're like, you can't hit me for 7 at range 1, and then you throw EX Collider at them,
and you say yes, I can.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So this is, it improves your trades. You mentioned one thing that you're doing pretty frequently as Tager is boosting this at range and then walking in. So your armor boosts are enabling your neutral play as much as they are like an aggressive or pressure tool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So like in various fighting games, there are characters like grappler characters This is not true of every fighting game. Different games deal with it different ways. But grappler characters will often have literally more life than other characters, or literally more defenses, where like they can take more hits. And this is basically that in Exceed, where you go, I'm going to put this into play, and now the next time I get hit one less, like one strike less, because I'm taking 3 less. And we were just talking about how that's a common value factor.
That tends to be about how much you would lose a strike by if you were to lose a strike.
Yep. So you go, okay, now I have this, and so they can hit me fine. I can play a collider, and it's not going to get stunned, and they're going to be 2 spaces closer. I can play an assault, and I'm going to be 2 spaces closer, even if I'm not hitting.
Right.
You know, I can do whatever, and it's probably going to be fine. And it's 3 less damage that I'm taking, so you're just paying 1 force for, 3 armor, which is better than the block exchange rate, I should note.
Yep.
And also, you are spending a turn on it, but again, take your life. Be patient.
Yep.
You're not spending much more than a turn on it because you're drawing for end of turn. What you are spending is a copy of this, and that's the main part you need to be thinking about is how your mix up weekends.
Make sure that you don't get rid of both of those.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
We talked about that command grab, so I just want to talk about the next command grab next.
Sure.
I love this card. Yep, 1-10-6. Maybe 1 to 3-10-6, but I'll be real. Generally, if I'm playing this attack, I'm not actually bothering with this before effect, because if you play this at range 2 or 3 and the opponent plays focus, you probably just lose. Like maybe the game.
Right.
Like you're extremely sad.
Right.
Because now you don't spend on the before effects of that, because that is up to. You don't have to commit to it. But you did spend 4 gauge on an ultra to lose.
To lose, yeah. Even if you didn't trade with the focus, even if it didn't hit you, you definitely lost that strike.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. You built up 6 gauge. You go to range 3. You throw this out, and they play focus, and you go, oh, I just threw away an ultra 4 gauge in a turn to lose a strike.
You might concede at that point.
It's bad.
Yeah.
So I don't often make use of this before effect. If they're out of focuses and equivalents, things that say the opponent can't move you, right? Then it becomes something that will tend to be unbeatable at ranges 2 and 3. You often want to initiate with it, because otherwise they can play across. Like if they initiate with a cross, they can get out of it. You don't want that.
Right.
But yeah, this is kind of your big, dumb, exceptionally reliable, exceptionally high damage payouts. That is expensive commensurately.
Right, and so again, we're at that 5 gauge magic number kind of threshold where suddenly this goes from being just threatening to probably unbeatable.
Yeah, where you go, oh, I have on curve 10 damage.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's not supposed to happen.
Yep. That's sure. I'll take on curve 10 damage. I personally like on curve 11. I think I mentioned before I'm slightly notorious for EXing this as an attack.
Yeah.
That is a lot of card to throw at a single strike.
Yep.
But it also means that your opponent is at 11 life and then they're dead.
They're dead.
And people are often not prepared for that.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I'm not used to there being a second digit on a power in an Exceed card. I'm not usually feeling like I'm super pressured until I'm down to a number that's lower than 11.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people are generally not going to feel like they're in range. They're being threatened by lethal damage until they're down to 6-7 life. That's not necessarily true for you.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, so this boost, I've already kind of talked about it. Much like the ability, it's a thing that when you need it, you need it. And it also, it's a thing that says that the board state isn't what the opponent thinks it is. If they need it to be X, you can make it Y, and you can do it right now.
Right.
Note that closing and pulling are different. If you have the choice between one of the two, think carefully about the board state. Right. If you're here, it depends a lot on what you're playing. This, like pulling in, means that you're threatening a grasp, throw them into the corner. Think about that, because it means they are likely to play a sweep or a focus.
Right.
If you do this, you're not really threatening that. You're now likely to play something like Collider, because they're going to be like, this looks like they want to play a cross to get away. Yeah. Right. There's a lot of situations in which it's obviously better, but like, think about what you're threatening based on whether pull or close is better. Or right. I said that backwards.
And you advocated, or at least you mentioned the possibility of a little while ago using both in one strike if you really need to change the board state very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right. I have definitely been in the position of, okay, close 2, pull 2, strike. my opponent has to decide if I'm playing the collider that actually hits,
Right.
because it does actually hit, and then it makes this. Which let me make a note of that, by the way.
Yeah, that's a
We're at range
big
8.
shift. Yeah.
This boost and a gauge, and this attack make this happen.
Yeah, I mean that's like gyro drive smasher movement. Like that is a massive
Yeah, the number of spaces moved by both cards is ridiculous.
Yeah, that's really, really crazy.
Yep.
But again, very expensive to make that happen. You got to make sure it's worth it.
Yeah, you got to make sure it's worth it. There's plenty of characters against which, in this situation, you just kind of shrug and play Spark Bolts, which will come to next.
Spark Bolts, and you're feeling okay.
Yeah, because most characters are not significant threats at range 8. And you won't be forever. But like when you stop being a threat at range 8, then you can decide you're not at range 8 anymore.
Right.
And neither are they. Okay. Any further comments or questions on this card?
Nope.
Cool. All right. Yeah. So talking about range 8 and range 8 options, we got Spark Bolts. This card is going to, well, in my experience, this card catches a lot of people by surprise because they see that you have 4 or 5 gauge. Do you know what they see?
Right.
This card.
The big scary
yeah.
one.
They're like, oh geez, you're building up 4 or 5 gauge. You're going to pummel me with this ungodly, horrifying, unstoppable, unbeatable. What am I gonna do? Well, I'm gonna not be in range of it.
I'm gonna
leave.
Yeah. Spark Bolt them.
And then you Spark Bolt them, and now they're at range 1, and it's your turn, and you still have that same amount of gauge, and so you hit them.
Right.
Yeah, because this is a pull 2 gain advantage. So at range 5, it becomes 3, and then you can play Assault. At range 3, it becomes a 1. Or actually, at range 5, you can go to range 3 and then play the other one. But yeah, like you can. I have done that. I have done the start at long range.
Spark Bolt.
Yeah, Spark Bolt, Assault. I don't remember what I played after. I'm sorry, but I have done that.
Do you know who does remember what you played after is your opponent? They're never going to forget that for as long as they live. Whoever it was.
Probably.
Yeah.
But yeah. So at range 5, this is a very solid projectile where, depending on the speed, depending on what your opponent has in their kit, you may well be in a situation where this attack doesn't necessarily lose to anything. If they don't have a projectile, then what are they going to do? Dive in? Okay, cool.
Right. Awesome.
They dove in.
That sounds great. It's like you would spend 2 gauge over 2 strikes to make or a gauge and a half. You know, you're getting you're getting 3 spaces of movement out of that. That sounds good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It is a little sad that you had to pay a force on it, but you know that's the value difference that we're getting.
Right.
But yeah, so Spark Bolt tends to be just a deceptively good card, especially once you start to build up that gauge. And is another reason that I don't really favor using your ability all the time.
Right.
Because you don't want to be always low on gauge, or Spark Bolt just gets a lot worse.
Right. And because Spark Bolt is more important and more powerful than people seem to think it is, using your ability is a little bit less important and less powerful than people think it is.
I would say that's a fair assessment.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so in other projectile character or against other projectile characters in projectile wars, you'll often want to bolster this with, as I think I might have mentioned, but to just mention again, something with defenses. Usually not so much this one, because against people with real projectiles, you care about having 4 defense, so 1 armor 3 guard or 2 armor 2 guard.
Unless they have like specifically a very, very fast projectile or something, it's probably going to hit for more than 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you'll care about having these up, in which case you can trade favorably into things like Hadouken, where you hit for more and then you also pull them in, so it's more awkward for them to persist in what they're doing.
Right.
But yeah, notably the boost on Spark Bolt is another high defense card. You usually don't play it on Spark Bolts. Usually this is a boost you want to play at range 1. You know the running joke can exceed about range 1, right?
Yeah, speed doesn't matter there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a grain of truth to that, right? Where you go, okay, at range 1, they are not going to play Spike, and they're not likely to play Dive. So I can play this, and now, I have -2 speed, and I don't care.
Right.
And I can play Atomic Lighter at range 1, and it has 4 armor, 3 guard, and hits the board.
Yep.
Cool. Like,
yeah, that sounds like that's a good combination of cards that you've just found.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I guess I'll just do this.
Right.
Yeah, typically when you play this boost, the opponent is going to leave range 1 so that they can threaten Spike or Dive. That's a situation in which you're likely to either walk or use one of your 2, sorry, actually, we're at range 1 buttons.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, don't underestimate the value, however, of initiating with a assault with this, because people look at this and they see a nice, juicy way to play spike and win. But if you initiate with assault, you are a speed 3 assault into a
Right.
speed 3 spike.
You're
You still win.
you're winning the speed tie on initiation. Sure. How often
Yep.
is the you cannot be pushed or pulled rider important?
I use it specifically when I'm up. So I use it in the other situation of Sparkbolt where I don't have these boosts and I'm up against somebody who does have the projectiles that will beat this. Where I go, okay, I can't win against their projectile because I don't have the boost that would make this attack win, and I don't have the gauge. So I'll play this boost, and now they can hit me with the thing that pushes me, and I will take 4 less damage, which covers almost everything that is appreciably fast.
Right.
While I play my dive, assault, or atomic glider.
Right, and so you're again, it's a neutral tool enabler.
Yeah, exactly. And I will very often, so at range 4 or greater, I will very happily play this boost and just play a dive when they strike against me.
Right.
Where I'm like, yeah, they're not going to push me back. And if they hit me, so there are mid-speed projectiles that I might have an issue with. In that case, I might play assault instead. But you have the idea of it.
Sure.
They probably don't have a thing that is going to completely break this at range. Some do. Characters like Cyrus have things like Albatross Talon. There are projectiles that can do that. Be aware of them. In that case, maybe you don't do that. But yeah. So I'll play it when I need Sparkbolt to do things that I currently can't make it to, or I'll just play it at range 1.
Right.
And at range 1, I'm also perfectly happy to play this and just play assault. Because it's 4 armor assault. What are you? Yeah, you're not gonna grasp me. You might cross away. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you were worried about crossing anyway, and you've just made up 2 spaces of movement on the cross. You're still at range 2.
Yeah, like that is a perfectly acceptable way to lose to cross. Of all the various ways that I have, which I'm sure I will have many. Like you will lose to cross a decent amount of time. That's fine.
Sure.
But yeah, this boost is just absolutely good. But be wary. Looking at you, Under Night and Guilty Gear Strive players, be wary of characters who can rapidly change the board state and then immediately do something.
Right.
So things like dash cancel, where oops, the opponent wasn't at range 1, they're at range 3 and they're striking, and now they have their unbeatable spike or their dive and it's their turn.
Right.
Yeah, that's where you don't want to have this.
Hanging out at range 1. I mean, we just talked about how important it is for your opponent, for Tager's opponent, to be very wary of things where they say, "Oh, you thought we were at a range? No, we're not, because I have this."
Right.
Against
so if they have those things,
yeah, against characters who can action compress into Tager, that's something that he needs to worry about too.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And this boost is the thing that is vulnerable, where if you just have 3 armor in play, okay, you can action compress. I'll probably still be fine.
Right.
But that's true of most things. But this introduces a drawback.
Negative speed is actually very, very dangerous, because the things that are super threatening at range 3, this is equivalent to your opponent having +2 speed most of the time. Those things don't care about armor.
Yep. Yeah, you're mostly going to be eating a spike. And it is acceptable, depending on the situation, to go, oh, they're initiating at range... They did a thing, they're initiating at range 3, they're probably playing spike, or dust, if you prefer. Right. And I'll play cross and evade. But now we're here, and you threw away Sparkbolt to do it, right?
Yeah,
so
that's
a cross.
That's a lost exchange to you for sure. But
yeah, like I would typically prefer not to let that happen.
Right. Sure.
But yeah, so generally I don't want to have this in play if my opponent is a character that I know has the tools to do that.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of good cases where you can just kind of throw it at range 1, and now they won't be able to do anything to you.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay, that's Sparkbolt. Oh yeah, we'll take a moment to admire this. Yep. So this is just more power and more guard. It means that when instead of having a boost in play to wage projectile wars, you just win the projectile war anyway, because you have a 4 guard projectile.
Right.
Which honestly, if you're in Exceed mode playing Sparkbolts, I'm confused, because if you got to 5 gauge, you probably played Sparkbolts at 6 speed to hit them and pull them in.
To pull them in the first place, right?
Yeah. But if you're against somebody at long range, you can get a free hit in.
Sure. And in terms of what the Exceed mode does for you, you just got done talking about how this boost and this boost give you the 4 defenses that you need to make this safe even with low gauge. Oh, look. There's
Yeah.
4 more defenses.
Yeah, you went down on gauge to exceed. Oh, well, now you have the 4 defenses anyway.
You can
So
still
it
play
becomes
Spark
just
Bolt
kind of
specifically, right? Okay,
just kind of becomes a solid projectile.
makes sense.
And then it's a little more damage, although that often won't matter because it at this point is probably a slow projectile. It's not going to be faster than many things if you're in exceed mode,
And
unless you built a truly unholy amount of gauge.
And a lot of projectiles that are trading into this would have about 5. So they would, even with sort of like middling gauge, you probably aren't going to stun a counter projectile.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not another slow projectile. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Last time. Well, first let's talk about this boost actually, because man, I've talked so much about how good this boost is. This is a good boost.
Yeah.
This is a boost that we will affectionately know as tech bait.
Yep.
And that's fine. Like you shouldn't be relying on this as a last ditch efforts because you desperately needed these defenses. You have a lot of other ways to have defenses if you desperately need them. You can have defend for 1 armor, 3 guard. You can have this for +3 armor. You can have this for +4 armor depending on your range.
Right.
This should be the boost where you go, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about my resources. I've got some viable threats. I now want to either enforce that at range, I have a spark bolts or an atomic lighter, or at close range, I'm amping up the amount of threat that I have. So I said earlier I normally would not boost at range 1. This boost is kind of always good to play if you have the resources to play it. It is very, very, very strong. And also, if they tech it, okay, dive beats a decent number of your threats. That's fine.
Right.
Like they can't dive over Atomic Lighter or Crimson Punisher anymore. That's acceptable.
There's several things here where you were talking about the fiddliness of spending a whole lot of like for something like Reach or something like Powerful Blow, where you really, really don't want. You've engineered a situation where you beat everything except dive can still go over you. Well, if they're teching that now, they can't do that.
Right.
Okay.
So it's generally fine. It's also a boost where, although the power is great, like don't feel. Be careful not to commit super, super hard to I really must make this payout happen. It's also fine to just say I have 2 armor, 2 guard, and I'm gonna plod through the next strike like I do every strike.
Right.
Where even if they did something that makes it so that I can't win the strike that I was hoping they wouldn't do, I'm gonna play my Collider, my Punisher, my Assault, my Dive, and just make up some grounds.
Right.
That's fine. It's not ideally what you'd want, but it's fine.
Right.
If you are in that kind of situation, you might just throw this card as force. But
okay. Yeah. And with economic concerns like Tager might have, sometimes your ultras are just 2 force.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. This it's kind of funny to me that this is a boost that's like is a reason that I don't use this attack as force all that often because, the card is force. Because like, why would I walk 2 spaces forward if I can close 2 and strike in most cases? That's fine. But there are some cases where I'm okay giving the opponent turn, but usually I would rather play the boost than spin the attack force. However, there are cases, although it pains me, where I need to change cards, and throwing this away is a thing that I have to do.
Right.
If that's the case, it means that I'm at the bottom of my first deck, and I don't have the gauge to play it. Like, I'm not going to throw this attack away if I can help it, if I have, like, 4 gauge or almost 4 gauge.
Sure. If you can find a way to 4 gauge with your hand, you want to play this card.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the reason I said bottom of my first deck is I'm mostly willing to put it in my discards when I know it's going to be back in my deck very, very soon.
Right.
I don't want it to be in my discard for the rest of the game.
Right.
So in contrast, this attack is not the stupid dumb guaranteed payout that this other card is. It is instead kind of a reliable. Okay, it's got 2 armor. It is a 1/8/1/2/6 that you can play at 3 gauge, and it's fine. But you generally have better mitigation tools than that. The way this shines is when it becomes an option select, where you have 5 gauge, you play it, and now you have the option of catching a grasp with it, or another kind of movement button. You're still generally going to start at range 1, though. You don't generally play this at range 2 or 3 in most cases.
Okay.
There are exceptions. The big notable thing this does is that when you initiate, it stuns focus. That's like the most important feature of this as an attack, in my opinion.
Right. And you were talking quite a bit about how many things focus gives him.
Yes.
How many things in Tager's kit have trouble with focus?
Exactly. So people go, okay, I can play focus and I feel comfortable. I feel safe. He's not in exceed mode. He only has 3 gauge. It can't be Genesic. I'll play focus and I'm safe. And then they get stunned.
Right.
Like,
right.
I have done that a number of times because that's the tendency is for people to assume that focus is safe at range 1 because it against
It
most of the
often
things in the
is.
kit looks
Yeah.
fine.
So
Yeah.
when you talk about the option select, is it kind of like if you have this in your hand, unless you have engineered a situation where it's the right time to play it, you're more likely to play Demon Cells. But like with Sledgehammer, if it comes up in a wild swing, you're very happy because you can play that option select.
Yeah, and I'm particularly happy where I have 4 or 5 gauge because the options like there I'm talking about is actually the before effect because this is
Right.
a before
Right.
to spend gauge to close. Where I go, yeah, this means that as a wild swing at range 1, 2, or 3, as long as I have enough gauge, so 3, 4, 3, 4, or 5 respectively, this might be viable, and it's viable against a lot of things. It mostly just loses to spike,
Yeah.
like a bunch of things do at that range, as I've mentioned before. But yeah, so I usually use this as my range 1 focus breaker when the opponent was waiting for my 4th gauge and I didn't have it.
Right.
And that is a serviceable job. I have occasionally used it for I really needed the armor, and my opponent struck. I really needed to have this armor and didn't have anything else, but that's a much more niche situation, I would say.
With the amount of armor that doesn't cost 3 gauge in Tager's kit, you can probably get by.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Until you can't, and then you play it.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And then this is also, I love this attack, or I love this boost because partly because I love overextending, but I love this boost for all the reasons that I've talked about. But yeah, between the two, this is the Ultra Alpeus Force.
Okay.
This is I need to walk forward 2 spaces. I still want to have Genestic available to me. I'd rather spin this than the other.
That makes sense. And then you mentioned a little bit that it actually is occasionally sometimes viable to have that Exceed Mode rider on this card, but it does require a pretty ridiculous amount of gauge built up over time.
Correct. Yeah, so we'll take a moment to admire the Exceed Mode. This one is very funny because this is not this is 2 armor, 10 guard, and if I've got it right, 13 power. Yes, can I do math?
Looks like it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So you'll note our power thresholds, by the way. For 1 force, we got 7 power.
Yep.
For 3 gauge, we got 8 power.
Yep.
And then for 8 gauge, for 4 gauge, we got 10, and then for 8 gauge, we got 13.
We have 13.
And I think I skipped over the. Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
You like 5 gauge for 16.
Right.
So generally speaking, I will prefer these 2 as payout options over Magnatech Wheel.
Right.
The hit Exceed Mode plus 4 power is you managed to get an absurd amount of gauge, so you got to do whatever you wanted, and this was the thing that you decided to do to win. But you probably could have done a lot of other things to win at that point.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, you hit Tager Buster twice almost.
Yeah, like you had an obscene amount of gauge.
Right.
And that's a great position to be in. It means that as somebody where your gauge, like you have all these great ways to spin gauge, you get an excessive amount of gauge, cool. You probably just win.
Right.
You will kill people that way. It's pretty useful. But yeah, so it's funny because I think it's funny in that the interactions that change for this in Exceed Mode are among the least significant. Where it goes from 8 power to 13.
Yeah,
but that doesn't change any breakpoints.
You were already stunning everything at oh man, I can't wait to beat EX Focus now.
Yes.
EX Focus when they have defend to play.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. There's like there are breakpoints, they probably don't matter.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, this is the one that has a specific call out for the Exceed Mode written on it, but all of the other ones that are a little bit more subtle might be more important.
Yes. Yeah. Like if this one didn't have that Exceed Mode rider on it, then there would actually be way less of a reason to use it in Exceed Mode because you wouldn't care about those number differences. You would save this for when you were back in basic mode and needed a card that had printed defenses.
Right.
But yeah, it's still often not efficient to use.
Right. But it is cool, and that matters too.
Mm-hmm.
So
and it is an important part of the range 1 mix-up, in my opinion.
Yep. Makes sense, especially for dealing with that focus. So
specifically for playing focus.
We've mentioned the Exceed Mode a couple of times here as we've gone through the kit, and I just want to be explicit about it. So we've got the same rider as on front side about his movement restrictions. That hasn't changed. And instead
you want to read that again?
When you would move yourself 2 or more, you may instead move only 2.
You may instead move only 2. Yes, Exceed Mode has a range 2, 3, and 4 dive.
Oh.
That has 6 power and 4 guard.
Okay,
That's an incredibly good dive.
that's interesting.
Yes, and can run 3 spaces forward.
So you can basically like fast fall. You can like stop your own movement short.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. The only interaction that actually cares about this is dive, but it's an important one.
Yeah.
Like the ability to stop short, it gives you the range 2 dive that you always had, but also the range 4 dive that everyone else had.
Also, okay.
Well,
Interesting.
3
Yeah.
and 4 dives.
I never caught that. And then obviously on top of that, you've got your stat boosts. And
Yeah,
then your
that's usually the important
overdrive.
part.
Yeah, your overdrive is kind of uh fulfilling a similar role to your gauge expenditure on front side, but
Yeah,
it's
you're,
just
you're
happening at the beginning of your turn.
yeah. For the most part, the reason this overdrive is important is you paid 5 gauge to have these stats for 5 turns, but because you don't have that gauge, you can't use your ability to pull.
Right.
So instead of you spend a gauge to pull 2 when you do that, you now can do it at the start of your turn, and it also allows you to like when you're not striking every turn, which you're ablaze with character in overdrive, you want to strike a lot when you're in exceed mode.
When you're doing it.
Yeah. And actually, hold on, let me make that explicit, because I have talked a lot about Tager being patient, somebody who is perfectly willing to sit back on the back foot, doesn't need to press his advantage all the time. When you're in exceed mode, you probably want to strike every turn you can.
Right.
Because you want to get the most value to this that you can.
Right.
And because of this overdrive effect, you're probably never going to be out of range.
Yeah, so because you can run your mix-ups. Your mix-ups are going to be more powerful. In some cases, they're going to be much more guaranteed because of your additional guard, and they can't get out of range as easily. So you're pretty much happy all around when you're exceeded.
Yes, and generally you want to be striking every turn, because otherwise you probably didn't get, like, if you don't strike at least 3 turns when you're in exceed mode, you probably didn't need to spend the 5 gauge.
Right.
You really want to get a lot of value out of that, because there is a lot of potential value out of it.
Right.
But yeah, the standouts are these 2 cards.
Right. So we've got the exceed mode, the 5 gauge exceed mode enables a lot of really crazy things in your kit. Your ultras, when they're bolstered by a couple extra gauge, are extremely, extremely powerful. And you mentioned that he's probably can afford one of those things and then a couple uses of his ability if he's playing very carefully and very well. How do you evaluate what payout to go for?
Okay, hold on. I need to give the correct answer here, because the true answer is not useful right now.
Okay.
The true answer is I always go for this one, because I'm addicted to this move, because
right.
Unless I run out of this, in which case I go for the astral. But that's because that's what I do in the video game. That's how I play Tager.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
I do gigantic Tager, and I do air driver, and I do a bunch of other things. I'm not very good at combos, but I love this attack. This attack is a very, very, very good command grab in the source material as it is in Exceed. So I just do that. But the useful answer of how do you evaluate which payout to go for is, I would say, like, genuinely, it's a decision of which resources. When I needed to spend resources, I made that decision. So now, later in the game, the decision was already made earlier. So at some point earlier, you decided whether you were going to spend this as force, or whether you were going to play this boost.
You're going to play the close boost. Okay, so you've spent these already, so the things that are going to be enabled by your exceed mode are less valuable.
Right, and so you go, okay, all of these are down. The exceed mode, or like my hand is a bunch of stuff where the exceed mode is not that valuable. So like grasp, cross, sweep, focus, right? Things where the breakpoints are not all that important.
Right.
Like, all right, I don't feel the need to do that. You lose all copies of this. You start looking for other ways to spin your gauge. You have both spark bolts. You probably don't want to exceed right now. You probably want to throw spark bolt at them a couple times. But yeah, so I would say generally you're making that decision when you're looking at the situation you're in and going, okay, now I need to spend resources. I'll decide what I want to keep out of my hand, what I want to spend, and then that's setting you up in the future.
Right. And if you found a way to run out of everything, that's when you reshuffle to get this.
Yeah, well, to get everything back in your deck, and then also to get this. And if the opponent didn't have parry, then you might very well be throwing that around too, as part of your suite of options. But yeah, you deal enough damage. Like, despite being kind of a slow-paced character, despite being somebody who values patience and can often let the opponent do stuff and give them a lot of time, which is a really, really dangerous thing.
Yep.
You have so much effective life due to your armor, and you deal so much damage due to your power. That's you're not really going to worry about going through your deck twice. You're not really going to worry about running out of your mix-up tools twice, it's fine to reshuffle even if you don't have like both of a bunch of things down.
Right.
Like you want to reshuffle to keep the important stuff live as much as possible, because when you get a little gauge, your opponent won't be able to stay out of your reach. If they can't stay out of your reach, you're running your mix-ups, and somebody's going to die. You don't have to land a lot of hits. You just have to land really, really heavy ones.
Right, a couple of really heavy ones to make up the difference. That makes sense. And then we've mostly talked about, I think, all of the normals and their use cases throughout. Just having sort of talked about them throughout the rest of the lesson. In terms of like the boosts on some of these attacks, we talked about defend a lot. We talked about all of his movement boosts quite a bit. For his big stat boosts and for things like reading and parry, I'm wondering if there's any important tech that we should know about.
So parry is a counterplay tool. It's universal. I say universal. It's a near universal defensive option, right? It's a defensive way to knock something out of your opponent's hands before it comes and hits you in the field. I like this is use at your discretion. As Tager, you are very happy to play a block at range 4 or greater, where you just build a gauge. And if your opponent builds a gauge, that's probably fine.
Yeah, your gauge is probably more valuable than theirs.
Yeah. Like gauge for gauge, you're probably happier than them because your stuff gets stupid when you start getting 5 or more gauge.
Right.
So I'll use parry, and maybe this isn't the most helpful answer, right? I'll use parry when I need to use parry. When I'm like, okay, I have to get rid of something.
Yeah,
my opponent has an astral.
I can't deal with this any other way. They're threatening it right now.
Yes, but as a Tager main, I find that's seldom the case. It's really like, okay, I need to get rid of this one dumb boost, or their reading, or their scramble, or their astral. Because most of the time, if they've got this one dumb thing that I have no way of dealing with, I can throw enough armor at it that I'm not that worried.
Yeah, but you have other defusal options just by being tanky.
Yeah, like if their one dumb thing I'm worried about is an ignore armor option, chances are it's something that a normal will beat. It's part of a mix-up. Like most ignore armor options are mix-up cards. They're overhead. They're command grabs of some sort.
Sure.
Which means that there's probably a way to diffuse it with something else. So yeah, I'm gonna throw armor at everything else. Play those honestly. Play into those mix-ups. Lose them, then hit them hard the next time around.
Right.
Like I'm fine with that. So I don't parry as much as I block just because of that value with gate. That's with Taker I probably do 50-50. That's because I, as a player, value parry very highly. I really like using this card.
Right.
Because I want to read my opponent's mind, figure out what they're doing, and then tell them they can't do it.
Right.
That's I like that. As for grasp and sweep, I hate to admit it, but grasp is a really important attack. Yeah. Because you have to represent it sometimes, because otherwise people will play fast buttons into you at close range.
You're gonna this becomes way less valuable if you're not representing the other half of the mix-up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
If you never play fast at range 1, then they never have a reason to respect it.
Right.
So you need to play grasp a significant amount of time. And I don't actually use Fierce all that much because like I don't need +2 power. I have all the power I need.
Makes sense.
Like it's not usually an issue that I'm concerned about. I'm going to either have demon cells or exceed if I really need a little extra power. But yeah, so I think grasp is actually pretty important. There are breakpoints that matter with +2 power, but demon cells,
Right.
Sweep. So Taker's not that good at playing light. This is because his range 3 dive does not cross over.
Right.
It's a little awkward. And then at range 3, your light spike is like, well, I could play light spike, or I could just play the assault and then be at range 1 and be pretty happy with that too.
And you'd prefer that anyway. So in order to get the most out of light, you're probably trying to put it on a really, really basically put it on Tager driver.
Yeah, like you're actually very happy to play light at ranges 1 and 2, where like at 2 you've got now the assault that catches cross and the dive that beats everything, and at range 1 you've got a speed 7 gigantic Tager driver. And if the opponent initiates, they're telegraphing grasp, and you can either play into the mix-up or you can throw EX gigantic Tager and they lose.
And they lose hard, right?
Yeah, like they lose really, really hard if that happens. So generally, like you'll play light at ranges 1 and 2. I find fairly often the reason that I'm playing lights is to contest or preempt my opponent's boost game. So if my opponent has a solid boost kit, then I'm going to be playing this in order to prevent them from just having a stat edge on me. Because as I feel like I mentioned at some point, but if the opponent is boosting every turn, I'm going to struggle with that.
Yeah, you will, even if you're constantly aggressing at range 1, if they're constantly boosting, you're still losing that trade most of the time.
Yeah, like I need to be doing other things than just flailing into them.
Right.
But yeah, so I'll tend to use light to preempt things, but I don't use it as much for the plays that other people do, where at range 3, light is a lot less impressive.
Right, because
I like that at 1 and 2.
Tager doesn't really have the ability to move in and also be unbeatable with dive the way that other people can.
Yeah, like if you throw your light spike out, you got 5 damage, but it's your opponent's turn and you're still at range, and
the situation has not changed that much, except that they're 5 damage lower and you're 1 boost lower.
Yes, and 1 gauge higher, but like I would probably prefer to just throw the mix up and say, is this spike or assault at range 3, and see which way it goes. Or play sledge and just win either way.
Right.
But yeah, so I like light, but not as much at 3 as most characters do. And then personally, I don't do a lot of reading as Tager. At least I don't play a lot of the reading boost. I definitely try to read my opponent. Sure. That's because this is, hey, two more armor, and this is yet another way to play patiently, where I can just say, whatever you're throwing at me, I don't care. Right. Like these are in many ways the same card, where you go, we're at range 3 or greater, 4 or greater especially. I'm going to gain 1 force of value and take 2 less damage.
Right.
Like
most of the time, that's all you care about.
Most of the time, it's enough.
Okay.
Like it's like I have enough life that I'm going to take all these little chips away at my health bar, and that's fine, because once I get closer, I'll throw my haymakers, and then we'll see who dies.
Gotcha.
So I tend to play a lot more focus. It's also nice to initiate with focus sometimes, for the same reason you want to initiate with grasp, is because you want to make sure that they can't play grasp safely at range 1.
Right. Right. Yeah. You need to again represent the mix up by beating their fast options.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And initiating with focus is a pretty solid way to do that.
That makes sense. Cool. All right. So that's the kit then. I tend to end the lessons by asking about counterplay, but before I do, any other important tips to share about anything Tager related?
I don't know. I feel like we talked about other than counterplay stuff. I feel like we talked about everything that I could think of offhand.
Awesome. Yeah. No. I certainly feel like I've learned a ton.
Excellent.
So I feel like that's a good sign. So the final question I always ask is, all right, you've now described the Tager things, and my opponent, who's competent and good at this game, knows all of the Tager things that I'm going to do, and they've put together countermeasures to stop it. What are those countermeasures, first of all? And second of all, that's what they're going to do. How is Tager going to play differently, or what am I going to do to stop them from stopping me?
Mm-hmm. Yep. The counterplay and the counterplay. So let's say, so firstly, as I mentioned before, if the opponent is sitting there boosting every turn and you're flailing every turn, you're going to have issues. The opponent boosting every turn is not automatically a lost state, though. Okay. If you're a character with a very strong boost kit, then you're generally going to be happy to play especially your power boosts, because if Tager can't reliably throw one of his defensive buttons, he's gets a lot more nervous. He's going to start to go, okay, my 7 guard might not be enough. And then he's going to be pressured to throw actual resources into something. So the way that playing a boost character in Tager works, in my experience at least, is the reason you're playing boost is less about the individual exchanges. It's more about watching his options narrow. Okay. And the onus is on Tager to preserve as much of his mix as possible, because what you're waiting for is, okay, he's finally out of that. Okay, he's got way less of that. Okay, I can breathe a little more easily in this particular area. Right. And it gives you a little measure of safety, where you go, oh, thank goodness, that's not an issue now.
And so it's on Tager to walk that tightrope really carefully and make sure that he's preserving everything while still threatening the things that he needs to threaten.
Yep, keeping things in balance and keeping your mix-up live, which is valuable. Yeah, which is essential for good offense in Exceed, period. But it's particularly important for grapplers. Right. And generally, the first thing that's going to go down, in my experience again, is this, which means that you're going to be, which is, as the opposing player, you're going to watch as he plays this at long range, and then when he plays the second copy, know that you can block at range 1, and be way, way more comfortable.
Right.
Because like block is often not efficient, but against Tager, like you block him, he's fine with it, but also he's probably going to give you the time to rebuild whatever resources you spent.
Right.
So if you block this payout, well, he probably paid out about as much as you're spending. You're probably going to have a comparable amount of time to him to rebuild your hand as he rebuilds his hands.
And you probably can make gauge better than Tager can. So you might
Right.
actually be ahead of that exchange.
Yeah, like you paid 4 force, he paid 4 gauge. That's way better for you than it is for him.
Right.
Is how blocking this card works.
That makes sense.
At least typically. But yeah, so generally you're going to be looking for his stuff to go down. The things you want to be especially careful of are, well, the stuff that I said was the best as him, right? Don't let this boost be free. Like, what is likely to happen, or what can happen if Tager's playing well, is he's going to put you in a position where you're like this, and you've got 1 to 3 cards in hand, and you're like, oh, I can't afford to just leave. He's just going to chase me. He's just going to pull me back in, right? But if you play run, right, go to range 3, then he pulls you back in and strikes. That's still better for you than if you let him play this,
right? In
my opinion, because it's now we're playing a mix-up. I participate in a mix-up that's very bad for me, but I'm out of the corner. Maybe we'll see. He might play grass, but like I'm momentarily out of the corner, and he paid a gauge to enforce this mix-up instead of gaining a gauge and still holding this mix-up over me
and keeping you in the corner still.
Yeah, and keeping me in the corner.
Right.
So like, yeah. So running out to range 3 is a thing that can feel bad because he's just going to pull you back in. That's fine. Make him pay the cost. The more times he has to pay the cost for his ability, the better it is for you.
Right. So deny him resources by making him spend them.
Right. Now there are limits to that. You want to be careful. Like the temptation is also going to be if you get out here and he doesn't strike, you go, oh, thank goodness. Backstep. I'm going to go out to range 7. You've just forfeited. Right. Like unless your character with range 7 options, he's going to pop you a spark bolt a couple times before you can do anything about it, and that's free gauge for him.
Right.
Don't take it to an extreme when you're trying to run away from him. Make it so that he has to spin to catch up to you. Don't make it so that he has free spark bolts. So and that will depend in part on whether you're a projectile character or not. The other major thing that you can do against him in general is pressure him as hard as you can, as long as you can. He does not like characters who throw big power and are rushed down. He does not like characters like May or Sea Viper or Fight, for that matter, actually.
Sure.
Where Fight usually is a little bit more setup oriented than the other two. But generally, he doesn't like the characters who can be in his face, throwing extra power at things all the time, which I know from the sound of that, you're like, well, nobody likes that, right? Like, who would? But the issue is, as I mentioned, like him wild swinging every turn on defense, especially with the opponent having essentially a power boost every turn. That's shaky for him. That's going to be an issue, especially in the long term. He's got too many things that are a little bit too fragile.
Even in his best case scenario, he needs to do something besides just punching them over and over again.
Right. Like you're at range 1 and you play assault against him, and he has to have one of these specials. His other specials won't cut it.
Right.
He has to start invalidating Gigantic Tiger at range 1, which he's very sad to do.
Right.
Right. And also, the more you make him wild swing in the first half of the game, when he doesn't have 3 or more gauge, the likelier he is to invalidate cards that he does not want to, especially his ultras.
Right.
But yeah, so pressuring him even at close range is generally a good idea. Like staying on top of him, not letting him have the time he needs, because he makes very, very good use of time. Despite needing a lot of it, he does use it well.
Right.
Like he can get a solid amount of value out of those little prepare actions or play a boost past turn actions, where what he's actually buying himself is time.
Right.
But yeah, you above all don't give him free gauge. So these two things, don't let those things happen. And then yeah, don't be afraid to pressure him. At some point, I'll also note this. At some point, he's going to make you participate in a mix-up that you are not likely to win. That's life against grapplers. In the same way that the grappler accepts losing most of the game in return for playing those mix-ups, you need to accept dealing with those mix-ups because you need to then win the rest of the game.
Sure. Yeah.
Your job is to say that you have lost all of the exchanges that aren't these mix-ups.
Right. It's a situation where it's like you can't just say just be right trademark against Tager, because sometimes he's gonna throw you into those situations where you're heavily disadvantaged. But it is your job to do that, is have that happen as infrequently as possible.
Right. Yeah. And when he does that, it might well be in a situation where you can't be right because you threw away all your resources to do other stuff, or
Right.
you're at the bottom of your deck and he just knows that you don't have anything speed 6 or faster, and so he's going to get you for free or whatever.
Right.
You go, yeah, all right. I'll lose on the grappler's advantage turns. Make sure that you are winning consistently on the rest of the turns.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the biggest way to do that is don't get hit by Spark Bolt. Like, don't give him a free Spark Bolts. Don't give him a free Gadget Finger. Make him pay to keep up with you. He will keep up with you. Like, as long as he gets a gauge, as the first gauge he gets is going to start an engine that will make it so that if he wants to keep you in reach, you will never be out of reach. But make him actually pay to fuel that engine. Don't just let him keep up with you.
Because the alternative is that he gets an overage of gauge and then you're probably just dead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, if he gets 2 Gadget Fingers in a row, you have effectively lost 8 to 10 life, based on how much value he's going to get out of that. Like, at least.
That makes sense.
Yeah. If you are yourself a range 1 character, by the way, then I come back to my just pressure him a lot, because if you're throwing comparable range 1 stats to him, throw them at them as much as you can to prevent him from being able to build up EXs and to draw into the boost attack combos that are especially nasty to deal with.
That'll let him because is it true that he's able to keep you at range 1 more effectively than other grapplers? Is his range 1 game like slightly less terrifying than theirs?
If he's not in Exceed mode, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, his Exceed mode turns everything on and makes everything super reliable, but he's got a little bit more fragility. Like, this is really, I think, evidenced by Atomic Lighter, where the only 3 guard in Atomic Lighter is a glaring weakness.
Right.
And like, the fact that this has that weakness is extremely noticeable.
Right.
Like, he does have big grappler strengths, but they're fairly expensive, and then his weaknesses are pronounced. So yeah, poor confirm on Crimson Punisher. This only hits at range 1, and then Atomic Lighter having poor defenses are the like really notable factors there. So he's very gauge reliant. He needs to build up his resources in order to become unstoppable. So if you are playing a grappler who has, if you're playing Zangief, Potemkin, whatever, then you will probably outstat him at range 1 much more cheaply. The thing that you need is to not let him hit that threshold of, I can now throw around a bunch of resources to do insane things, whether it's the Exceed mode or it's the Ultras that are even better than yours, or what have you. Did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. So that's
hang on. I guess the counterplay.
Yes.
It's essentially what I talked about at first, right? If your opponent is pressuring you at close range, repeatedly, like this is bad for you, but the answer is probably not to just flail at them wild swinging. The answer is probably to prepare to change cards, to build a larger hand. If they're being really aggressive about it, like somebody like Solar Sea Viper, who's just striking every bloody turn, or May, then I would actually say go hard on change cards to build like a strong hand. You can't just say, yeah, I've got this hand of like spike, sweep, assault, dive, like one of every normal-ish at range 1. That's good enough. No. Ditch the half of the hand. Ditch the worst half of your hands to draw something much better that you can work with.
The X's get important boosts. Like, actually, curate your hand rather than just take what comes to you.
Yeah, actually dig. Like dig through your deck a little more aggressively, or a lot more aggressively, because if they're reducing your life bar, if they're depleting your health very, very quickly, you may not actually be able to afford the time.
Right.
It's lovely to have all this armor unless you never get the chance to draw it.
Right.
And there are characters like Soul, May, and Sea Viper who actually are capable of dealing 30 damage before you've seen 15 cards.
Right. Sure.
So be careful of that.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's when you play patiently when your opponent lets you play patiently.
Yes, like you generally, against most characters, like by default, you're going to be playing the longer game. You're going to be playing the slower game. You are going to gain more value over playing the slower pace. The opponent is trying to force you to play at a faster rate that is better for them.
Right.
That's what you should expect to be kind of your default assumption.
Okay.
That you're not the one who is setting the pace. You're the one who's trying to drag it down.
Right. Got it. That makes sense. And so everything that we've been talking about this whole time is kind of being seen through that lens, that like, this is what you're trying to do. This is what they're trying to stop you from doing. Meet closer, meet in the middle, but closer on your side if you can.
Yep.
Got it.
And yeah, and it all kind of comes down to you are trying to accumulate gauge, because gauge is what you turn into winning the game with your really dumb suite of
Your
options.
payouts. Sure. Got it. That makes sense. Awesome.
All right, I think that's what I had to say about that.
Well, D, that was excellent. I cannot wait to go give Tager a try. I hope that people listening, I know that this character is maybe not unpopular, but I think undervalued a little bit. I've seen definitely some capital D discourse around Tager. I hope that people do reevaluate him a little bit, and give him another try. I'm certainly going to. I'm really excited to try him out. So thank you so much, as always, for your time and your expertise, D.
Excellent. Yeah, delighted to. Again, one of my favorite characters. I'm very, very pleased and proud to stick up for this large red man.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that he is unfairly overlooked, and hopefully, audience, you agree, and at the very least, you had some fun and learned some things watching. So, thank you so much for your time and your attention as well, audience. And I will see you all next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Mm-hmm. Stay hydrated. Bye.